This is Tommy's Outdoors 120. And today we are going to talk about benthic habitats. What is benthic? Well, everything that is to do with the bottom of the body of water. So seabed or seafloor, if you like, for the purpose of this podcast. And our guests today are once again those lovely scientists from the MarPAMM project. In particular, Dr. Alex Callaway from the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute. Alex was already our guest in episode 104, where 104 was kind of like an general introduction to MarPAMM project. Then Dr. Chris McGonigle from the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences. Professor Andy Wheeler, the chair of Geology from the School of Biological, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University College Cork. And Jer Summers, also from the University College Cork, who is a PhD researcher in the MarPAMM project. So we are going to talk about benthic habitats, specifically seabed habitat mapping and modeling. That's the work package that we are going to focus in this episode of the podcast. And wow, I love talking with those scientists because they're passionate about what they do, and we could go on for hours. So just to give you a few highlights that we talked about really cutting edge technology, how they're gathering data for preparing those habitat maps and species distribution maps. They're using, among the other technologies, autonomous submarines, like a drones. They're using like a underwater drones as well, but also they have like a autonomous vehicle, so a little submarine that without any intervention of humans just does its stuff in a sea close to the seabed. So we talk about this. I found this fascinating from the like an engineering perspective, and then we are also talking how they are processing all this data, because there's like a massive amount of data that is being gathered. And so what they're using artificial intelligence to kind of process all that data and get some useful information. So fascinating episode. We also talked about kind of like a general ecology and importance, why it is important in one certain, those species, like they call it species of interest, why they're important, why they need to be protected as our MPA, because remember, MarPAMM is all about MPAs. So I'm sure you will enjoy this episode of the podcast if MPAs and oceans is your thing. As usual, before I let you enjoy this episode of the podcast, reminder, if you want to support me and what I do here on this podcast and support the podcast, the best way, the biggest way you can support the podcast is to share the podcast with your friends and colleagues and other people who might be interested in stuff that we talked about here, which is a lot of natural sciences, scientific stuff, but also outdoors experiences, human-wildlife interactions, and so on. Secondly, you can support the podcast, and you can do it right now by leaving in a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Just give me a 5-star rating. This is great help for the podcast and for me. And finally, if you want to support me personally, help me edit those episodes. Like I said many times, I'm doing this very early in the morning or very late at night. So coffee is always helpful. So you can buy me a coffee. buymeacoffee.com/Tommy'sOutdoors. The link is in the description of the show. I really appreciate all of you who already bought me a coffee. This is, like I said, great help for the podcast. And yeah. So now, without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, seabed habitat mapping with Alex Callaway, Chris McGonigle, Andy Wheeler, and Jer Summers. MarPAMM project. Enjoy. MarPAMM is an Interreg VA funded project. think that the only fair thing is to start with a round of introductions.
So I'm Alex Callaway. I'm the benthic work package lead and the science coordinator for the MarPAMM project that we're speaking about today. And I'm also the Seabed mapping lead at the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland.
Go on. I'm Chris McGonigle. I'm a marine ecologist based at Ulster University, and I'm working on the T2 package here, along with Ryan McGeady, who's a postdoc on our program. We're looking at basically skate population dynamics and then the innovative use of technology supporting seabed mapping and monitoring.
Right, I'm Andy Wheeler from University College Cork, also involved in T2 in MarPAMM. I'm the professor of geology in the university, and we're really interested in seabed mapping. And this is Jer.
Yeah, I'm Andy's PhD student. I'm working, the only PhD student in MarPAMM. I'm working on seabed habitat mapping and AI and how that can help us with seabed habitat mapping.
We have a big crowd today. You're working on seabed mapping and habitat mapping. I think the term is benthic habitats. So if you can give like a brief description exactly what the package of work consists of, and also how then it fits into the bigger MarPAMM project. And just for people, I'm going to repeat that again, that we spoke in detail about MarPAMM project in episode 104. So anyone who wants to get a refresher what MarPAMM as a whole is about can go back and listen to 104. But now we talk about this T2 package, work package. So please explain to listeners like what exactly is that work package.
I guess I'm going to be nominated for this one. So the T2 work package is the benthic work package. So benthic just means seabed. It's the system of the substrata, the sediments, and the associated fauna that live on the seabed. And what T2 is trying to do is trying to understand the distribution of a key suite of species of interest. So they could be particularly endangered or particularly vulnerable to a certain type of pressure. So we want to understand their distribution in the MarPAMM region, and that's being carried out through various distribution modeling techniques. As Chris mentioned, we've got the innovative use of technology, and that spans work that Chris is doing and that Andy and Jer are doing, and that's the use of things like remotely operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, and other systems that allow us to investigate the seabed in a different way that provides more information than we might previously have had, in the hope that enhances our ability to monitor and manage the marine environment, particularly within the scope of marine protected areas. And so all of our data for T2 and the other work packages are designed to feed in to a final work package, which is the MPA management plan package. So they're adopting or trying to adopt all of this new information that MarPAMM has generated into enhancing MPA management into the future.
Perhaps only a rider to that is the oceans are vast. So the MarPAMM area is Scottish waters, waters of Northern Ireland, and the border counties in the Republic. And what we're trying to do is really help the governments there in managing that marine environment and giving them the information and the tools to do so.
Yeah, and that politically that's really interesting for all of us, because it is like a trans-jurisdictional space, and that brings into questions of governance and kind of other thorny issues around territory, and which I'm not going to go into here. But that's a really interesting thing that underlines the need to have that kind of joined up approach. Because ultimately we've got a range of stakeholders that have different needs across these different jurisdictions, and we need to kind of recognize the value and contribution and role that each other have in a shared space.
The animals have no borders.
Yeah, exactly. But this is like a common thing in any sciences, especially natural sciences, whenever you talk about migration of mammals, or like you guys are doing. The political borders are of no significance to animals and so on. So tell me, is your work package and the research you're doing or methods you're using, is it being adjusted based on those boundaries, those needs like you mentioned, or you do your thing that is consistent across all the areas, and then if someone is missing something, then tough, and someone may have something that they didn't want it, but you just focus on your package of work. How does that work? Did you allow this to influence your work?
Well, no. So I would say when we're thinking about the species distribution models, as we've just said, the species don't consider the borders. So the modeling domains span the MarPAMM project area. So the only border that we have is what is the Interreg funding area? What is the MarPAMM project area that we're focusing on? So, but there are things that are inherently limited. We cannot put AUVs across every square meter of the seabed across all 3 jurisdictions. So we've had to select areas which we thought would be of the highest interest, key interest. And when we were out on survey last year, again, we had to pick sub areas to try and test what we'd been doing with the work. So you have to make choices, but the work package as a whole is supposed to sit across the entire MarPAMM region and not limit geographically or geopolitically.
But that is the really interesting thing as well, is that the kind of conservation priorities across the different domains may well be driven by different pieces of legislation, which underscores that point that actually the conservation doesn't happen in a vacuum like this. That the beauty is in the eye of the beholder in a lot of instances, where what might be a conservation priority in one area isn't necessarily to the other members. And actually that the source and sink dynamics of where that population originates might be in a completely different jurisdiction to where it is a priority interest. So it underlines the need to have that kind of joined up approach. Absolutely.
How big is this impact of what you just mentioned, like migrating or impact of one geopolitical area on the other in terms of MARPAM area? Because, like, for example, example that I have on top of my head is like migrating birds, right? That the guy who shoots ducks in Alaska may impact then something that is in Europe or somewhere else. So how big is this an issue for you?
So if you want to say that's really, I suppose, down to the life history parameters of the species of interest. And for us in T2, the only one that we're looking at, the only migratory or the only kind of nectonic species is the flabberskate. The rest of them are all...
Well, all benthic species pretty much, or the ones that we're looking at, I think is safe to say, have a pelagic life stage. So there is potential for larvae to flow from Ireland to Scotland, and actually that's the dominant flow because of our prevailing sea conditions. But that can be reversed, and there's different influences. But when you're thinking about birds, to quantify that impact, I don't think MarPAMM can address that. But we do have the fortuitous nature, I suppose, that up until recently we were all following EU legislation. So a lot of these protected features are covered by unified legislation. So birds are all covered by EU directives, which are adopted in the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And even though the UK has left the European Union, they're still adopting a lot of the principles, even if it's not by name. The legislation's just had UK written on the end, maybe, but we're still doing the same things. So actually, the species themselves, they're covered. They've got their insurance policies at a level. It's the implementation of that management that can be differentiated. So, the UK has implemented a whole range of national marine protected areas, whereas the Republic of Ireland hasn't got to that stage yet. So there's a different facet of how marine conservation is happening, and how MarPAMM, in effect, can actually support that by offering these new evidence bases.
Yeah, but there's a lot of commonalities. I mean, Ireland is implementing marine protected areas, but hasn't got there yet. And in terms of the species distributions and flow of organisms across borders, and a lot of our approaches and a lot of the fundamentals of the data, there's a lot in common. So we can look at the differences between the jurisdictions, but actually the commonality is what's important, and that's why we're mapping this wider MarPAM area. So at least we've got commonality in data delivery to the policymakers, and they're at different stages of implementation. So we can make too much of this.
No, but I mean, it is really interesting that you're 100%. The underlying data that we use to predict the distribution of the species is common across the domains. But the limiting factor in lots of instances is the quality of the data about the species themselves, and that is the unknown quantity. So for loads of our predictive models, we've got great abiotic proxies we can use to tell us about why the things are where we see them, but we've got really limited data about where we have observed them and how they might be likely to respond to future change. So I think that's common across the whole jurisdiction, is that we've got insufficient data in lots of instances to really give us robust models.
This is great benefit of projects like MarPAM, that you have more data, because when I talk with people who are involved in conservation or marine protected areas or whatever, it's always common thing. It's like, we don't have enough data. We don't know how many fish we have. We don't know how many deer we have. We don't know how many badgers we have. Like, it's seldom that anyone dedicates any resources to actually finding out. And then when it comes to making policy, it's just basically like a shot in the dark.
But isn't that's the big issue with us, is that actually not having the best possible data doesn't leave you with the situation that you can tolerate actually not making management level decisions. So it's about having to be pragmatic and making decisions based on the best available evidence, which doesn't mean it's necessarily the best possible evidence. And that's the situation that we often find ourselves in conservation management.
That's a material for an entire different podcast, because then you have all the lobbying efforts and all the pressure groups and all these things. Like, all right,
who started this?
No, it's an integral part, and this is where this conflict comes in. And like someone said, like, conservation is managing conflict, really. Because scientists give it data and it's quite obvious what should be done, but then there's other people coming in, he's like, not so fast because X, Y, and Z. All right, folks, but we're not going to go there. Like, I'm just interested in, like, what are those species of interest? You mentioned this term, species of interest. So what are they?
So our core species that we've created the distribution models for are, as Chris mentioned, the flapper skate. So that was historically wrapped up under the umbrella of common skate, and it's been identified that there are actually two distinct species. So that's of interest. We've got merle, which is calcareous algae, which is very slow growing. It's coralline in its structure and can create a really nice three-dimensional environment for other species to exist in. We've got Arctica islandica, which is a bivalve, but it's extremely long-lived. There's estimates that some individual specimens are over 200, possibly 300 years old. Modiolus, another bivalve species, it can create biohermic reefs or biogenic reefs in these bioherm structures, and again enhancing the environment for other species. We've got sea pens in the mix as well. They're of interest because they exist in areas of soft mud, which is of key interest to the fishing industry, and sea fans. We've got two species in the UK, Unicella verrucosa and Swiftia pallida, and they grow on rocky, reefy areas. I think that's it. Somebody can jump in if I've missed one.
No, I think you're bang on, Alex. The thing is that we also have a couple of kind of ancillary species that are of interest because we can model them using similar techniques. So once we've established the modeling framework, it's relatively easy to kind of modify that to suit other additional species as well. But you're bang on there is the thing about that these are sessile species that kind of will release gametes into the water column, and basically that's the mechanism of larval dispersal. The contrast to that is the skate, which is more in common with the birds guys or with the marine mammals guys, where you're looking more at a mobile species that's got capacity to move around like that. So that's a kind of a fundamental distinction between the two groups,
Yeah, and I think with these species, I mean, there's a range of them there, and they're occurring in different habitats, from rocky to muddy and sandy. So it's not like we're just looking in one area. We're really covering a range of different habitats where these important species are, as well as other communities as well. So it's a good spread.
As usual in those cases, I have immediately so many questions in my head that I don't know which one to ask first. Okay, maybe
Ask the geology one.
Yeah, I lead with this one. Most of people, I'm guessing, most of people who listen to this podcast, they recognize flapper skate. They know what the algae are, and they have no idea what the other species are at all. And the question is like, why? This is a question actually, Alex. I remember when we were recording 104, because Alex was already on a podcast on Tommy's Outdoors in the 104. One of the questions that since then I was meant to ask you is why these organisms even matter. Like what like people listen like, oh, some things in the mud, like what do you care? Why are you even spending money and technology of investigating some things that nobody even heard about, why they matter? So that's I'm just obviously I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, but I would like to hear from you folks like why these animals matter and why it is worth to spend money and time mapping their habitat and then ultimately protecting them.
I think it's the same as you could level that question at any organism that people are trying to protect or take an interest in. They've all got their different different facets of interest. So the Modiolus, for example, like I said, that has the potential to create these biogenic reefs. And actually at the European level, you've got legislation, you've got Annex 1. So Modiolus reefs fall under the Annex 1 biogenic reef categorization. So that's got international protection level. So trying to understand Modiolus distributions and the conditions in which they exist and how they're distributed within the MarPAMM region, that's of benefit because that allows our legislative bodies in the devolved administrations and the Republic of Ireland to make a judgment on how to best conserve those and meet the obligations internationally that they have to do so. Arctica is interesting, such a long-lived species that that you have one organism potentially that has the full suite of contaminants from before the Industrial Revolution through it to now. The Norwegians eat them, strangely. I wouldn't fancy it myself, but you've got that just as a study organism. That's interesting. It's long-lived. It's existing in a part of the seabed in this crossover in this muddy, sandy, muddy environment. So you by each of these individual species, they've been chosen because they reflect the environmental conditions in a different way. So the sea pens, it's much more muddy, much softer. The flapper skate, they traverse all of these areas. You can find them in muddy areas, in sandy areas, and then with the sea fans in the rocky areas, they're exposed. They're filter feeders. They're exposed to different environmental mechanisms and different impacts. So the reason to care, I guess, is you shine a light on these things. We're a less polished blue planet. None of us are David Attenborough. But if you don't know about a thing, you can't care about it, and we can certainly increase the knowledge around that and increase the exposure. And to kind of flip the example, the Republic of Ireland have undertaken a huge hydrographic survey program. Why should the people of Ireland care about that? Well, actually, there's a whole submarine territory which belongs to the Irish people in some way, and now they can see it. So these things belong to everybody. We're all curators and we're all responsible for them. And so, I think that's the key bit to take forward is we've all got a small part of ownership and we've all got a small part of responsibility for these things that we're just through our actions as humans affecting in one way or another.
Yeah, I think, Alex, I'd love to jump in on that actually, is that point that the analog there about mapping the extent of the shape and textural nature of that territory is a really important thing to do from a understanding resource allocation and from a territorial mapping point of view. But then it's understanding basically that linkage between how organisms utilize those environments and whether or not we can actually make those direct kind of one-to-one relations to say, well, there is this sediment, there is this textural property, therefore there is this community. And that by necessity, actually, that relationship is more complex and more nuanced than we maybe can realize. And that actually some of the processes that are important for governing species distribution, we don't really well understand. Our knowledge of the species life history for some of these invertebrate groups is very poor. And some of it's based on Victorian observations from aquaria and things like this, So we don't really understand how important a lot of these groups are. And in complex systems where there's diversity, the diversity is the strength, is the resilience and its ability to cope with changing conditions. And if we don't, like, you think about this like a census style approach where we want to understand what there is where, first of all, so that we can prioritize better our protection, our area-based protection. If we don't know how much stuff we have, then how can we afford protection when we're resource limited in terms of trying to administer that protection? So I see this as putting the biological finish onto the geological mapping of our territories effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And your question is just a fundamental biodiversity question as well. I mean, who cares about these animals in the sea? Who cares about biodiversity in the sea? Well, we all should, because if you lose biodiversity in the sea and your ocean becomes unhealthy, it affects us. It affects our fisheries, and it affects also how the planet works. So this is an oceanic planet. So these may be individual species that people might not see the relevance of, but really it's about trying to protect life in the oceans, and that affects us. It affects our food supply, and the healthy ocean also leads to a healthy planet. So it's really, really important. We were talking about the seabed mapping there. People said, well, why do you want to know this? But if you don't know what's there, you can't protect it. And when you do know what's there, you realize actually this is really important. And what happens on the seabed, what happens in the ocean affects us, because this planet is 70% ocean. And we really need to realize that the oceans are really, really important to life on land. So we need to understand these things, and we need to keep it healthy. And if we're going to interact with the ocean, we need to know what we're doing and do it in a way that is sustainable with our buzzwords. But that's the important thing, and you can't do that if you haven't got information or you haven't got maps, for instance.
Yeah. But increasingly, there's a really interesting point. Another thing that we're dealing with is looking at different stakeholders' resource requirements in terms of people's historic use of space, and recognizing that, the biodiversity agenda and the conservation agenda is one part of that piece, but actually there are other stakeholders that have different vested interests, and that those are equally valid positions, and that we need to kind of deal with the challenges and the tensions of trying to work in a common space, and recognizing that not one group has got precedent over any other, and that's a challenging conversation to have.
How much is it overlap between mapping those animals, habitat mapping, and mapping a seabed? Because it's like, at least in the title, it says, like, you can almost think like, oh, you're doing two things: you're mapping habitats and you're mapping seabed. But now, as I'm listening to what you're saying, my question is like, how much there's an overlap? How much by mapping seabed you're already mapping habitat, or how much by mapping habitat is it like in fact one thing?
Oh, Tommy, that's a big can of worms, man.
Yeah.
Right, go for it.
I might deflect that question a little bit, and and talk about mapping. And we've got species distribution modeling, which is important, but mapping is. The seabed is perhaps not just finding out how deep the seabed is, but it's also trying to work out the attributes of it. And if you like, its habitat, currents and strength of currents and the type of substrate and where the organisms are. So one of the things that we're doing in this work package, as well as trying to produce these very important species distribution models, is really try to to get better and better ways and more advanced ways to do habitat mapping to advance our technology. And I'm kind of looking at Joe here because he's kind of directly involved in a lot of this as well as part of his PhD. The oceans are vast. The oceans are under-mapped. Okay, we've got charts. People are used to kind of Admiralty charts, but they're generally very low resolution and contain little information. But in the past few decades, technology has really increased in leaps and bounds, and we're getting better and better ways to map the seabed in more and more resolution and also map attributes of it. And one thing that's happening is we're creating now vast data sets because the ocean is so huge. And even the MarPAM area, in high resolution is just massive. So one of the things that we're doing is looking at using AIs and other computer tools to see if we can get them to interrogate the maps and get information out that's very important for habitats. Because humans are now becoming, if you like, the weak link. We can't handle all the data, but maybe we can train computers to take out really relevant information. And it's a really exciting place to be because we now have the computer technology and the power to do this kind of work that wasn't possible in the past.
And what's important about that is that when you have a PC or a computer algorithm looking to do this kind of information extraction, you have a very consistent model and very consistent algorithm doing it each time. So you know the information that you're receiving constantly through this framework. And it's very scalable as well. So we keep talking about this idea of vast information. Having one expert trying to extract all that information from this large data set is not the best use of that expert's time. That it could be applied to interpreting this information, or maybe trying to look at it through a very specific lens, or trying to get better quality data from it as well. So that's why we're talking about this AI processing as well. So we have this kind of computer doing the donkey work, so to speak, for want of a better phrase. And then the really kind of interesting interpretive work can be applied by your expert then in the field or office.
That's brilliant, Jared. And I often wonder is like the risk potentially then that we end up doing is kind of invalidating a lot of the expert effort and therefore doing ourselves out of a job. That you can end up with like the self-scanners in Tesco's, you're kind of going, keeping people on the checkouts, is keeping the handles turning. But there's bound to be like absolutely a sweet spot in recognizing this, that sometimes those automated routines, as well as they can work, that actually glitches in them might end up with a situation where you actually haven't realized that there's some fundamental problem until way, way, way down the line, because you've that disconnect between the expert human operator and like, I mean, we've come back to this conversation so many times in different aspects of our science over the course of the last 20 years. That will we ever be in a situation where we can completely do away with the need for that expert interpretation? And what do we lose by actually failing to cultivate that? Like for us, I know you would say the same thing, is the reason that you develop that expertise is by those years of spending picking through images or picking through samples. That's where expertise comes from. And in the absence of that, if it's completely steered by an automated process, does that lose something? Do we lose something collectively like that?
Yeah, and it's where humans and computers come together where there's a real strength. I mean, computers are very good at doing repetitive things extremely accurately, but they're very stupid and they make dumb mistakes, and humans are wired differently. We're very good at spotting patterns. We're predators ultimately. And so putting human expertise with the computers to monitor the computers can be really, really powerful. And there's certain things that computers are great at, but I don't think they're going to outcompete humans or biologists. Chris, you're safe. AIs are our friends.
But I think that's it. It's all about efficiency gains, isn't it? It's what can we do to relieve the burden, because we all want to collect more data and to go back to your question, I think, Tommy, it's like Chris said, it is a can of worms, and you can get bogged down in the pedantry of the definitions, which I often do. But it's hydrography, so the act of going out and collecting the data, that's not mapping. It's not a map until it's been processed and it's been turned into something else. And likewise, mapping the seabed or characterizing the seabed based on geological properties or geomorphological properties, it's incredibly valuable, but that's not habitat mapping. And when you go back to what the definition of a habitat is, it's an n-dimensional hypervolume. So we're already talking about vast quantities of 2D, 3D data for when we're trying to create these characterization maps for, to then try and morph that into an absolutely true habitat map. And this is where you have to kind of put the pedantry aside. You've added countless numbers of dimensions into that data, or into that data sphere, into that hypervolume that you then need to try and characterize. So you're trying to take this infinitely complex system and present it in an A4 page. It's an incredible task. So it's these things that, like what Jer's doing with trying to test these things, they're not ready to be let off the leash, but we need to make the effort to go, and that's what we're doing. And that if you can free up the space to ask more interesting questions elsewhere, then that's where the benefit comes.
But you're right, Alex, that's it as well, is that n-dimensional hypervolume concept is thinking like, right, well, we don't even know what the latent variables are for the species of interest. So what's important for species 1 is not important for species 2, or 3 or 4. And their interactions together are what gives rise to that concept of the habitat in the first place. And that the patchiness and the spatial and temporal variability in habitat structure and assemblage structure on the seabed doesn't necessarily adhere to these geological boundaries. And that is the disconnect, because now that sounds like I'm giving geologists a hard time or biologists a hard time, but it's recognizing that it's more subtle than that, I think, for all of us. And that ultimately the mystery that's hidden there in the workings that becomes a rounding error is difficult for those of us that want absolute truth, which is never anywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I guess it's like you gathering a lot of data and then analyzing the data and modeling, and then because it has to be named something, then it's named habitat and mapping and modeling and all these things. But
yep. But that's the danger, right? As well, is when we think about how those products that we create, which are like cartoon schematics colored in blobs, and that the risk is that those go to potentially into the hands of policymakers or management that want to use them to make decisions, and that we need to communicate effectively the limitations of those products, what the underlying assumptions are, and what the challenges around that are, and ultimately is to provide a measure of confidence in those products so that people can use them as tools, which is all that they are. They're only ever going to be a crude approximation of reality,
yeah,
no matter how well produced they are.
Yeah.
So that makes
it's
sense.
Always like, tell me how it is. Like, no, it's more subtle than that. It's like, all right, folks. So I guess, I'm taking it's like a two parts really what you do. You're gathering the data and then you're analyzing data. So let's talk about the gathering data. Like, what are the ways of how you're gathering those vast amounts of data that then are then being analyzed? I guess that part is the field work, and then the analyzing is the work. It's just less glamorous in the office in front of a computer. So before we start, maybe like what is a percentage? What is a percentage of the cool field work with the breeze in the and all these things, and how much of it is just in front of a computer?
Well, we're probably looking at 1% field work.
1%.
If we're lucky, and that still produces more information than you can process in a lifetime.
So how are you gathering those vast amounts of data?
Well, there's several ways. And there's several different types of data that we collect. So, if we're doing a standard map of the seabed, we use multi-beam echo sounders that are mapping the seabed with sound. But if we want to look at organisms or look at the seabed in maybe high resolution, we can tow camera systems along the bottom. But then we maybe want to sample the seabed. to see what specific organisms are there, particularly ones, in the sediment that you might not see in a camera system, or the smaller organisms. But that give you points of information as opposed to lines and areas. But then if we've got species that are mobile, we might want to put down called a baited camera, to track the organisms with some food and then see what's there. So there's very different types of data. You may put instruments down measuring current speed and other kind of things like that. So there's lots of different information. Some of it is aerial. Some of it is a line. Some of it is a point. And we have to sort of put this all together and try to understand a little bit about where the species are and why they are there and where the communities are. So there's lots of different information coming together to try to work out what is this hypervolume, if you like, of a habitat. Lots of different disparate data, but it takes a long time to work this up. So we're not out mapping the seabed all the time, but we are getting information. It takes a lot of time to process that information and get the information out of the data, and that's the important distinction.
And that's a brilliant one. It just has occurred to me again, thinking about scalability and AI, is like if you can find an AI that can process sediment samples, through a sieve, it's like, I want to see it, because I think after spending like back-breaking hours over a sieve in a fume cupboard, trying to rinse or stain or dye or separate material is like, there are bottlenecks throughout all of these processes. And it's like the technology often follows the easy wins. So we'll hear about where it works really well, but not hear about where it falls down. And that's a really interesting point.
It can free some time for people to just work through sediments because they don't have to analyze them.
But exactly that. But and this is, when we're talking about these innovative technologies, and we've mentioned the robots getting out there. So it's the same thing. The robots don't go down and do complex tasks by themselves. They're given very tight instructions. For the autonomous ones, they're deployed and they would go and do something like the acoustic surveys, or maybe a high-level camera survey. But that frees up the research vessel, which is this big, expensive platform, to go and do something different. So you could have your AUV, and then you're doing one mission, and then you can deploy your ROV from the research vessel, which is steered by humans. You can't disconnect humans from the ROV process at all. But that gives you more data to try and fathom how you're going to analyze them. But each step of this is you're trying to kind of lift the curtain a little bit more for the marine environment and just see what we're doing. And what the project has tried to do by utilizing that. So Chris has deployed the BRUVs, the baited remote underwater video cameras that Andy just mentioned there, and looking for skate, and you've captured some on image, and so that's a real win because it's proved the concept works. Both Andy and Chris's team, so I'm speaking for you now, but they've both done work with the ROVs, which are being utilized in different facets of the project. So there's the technology opens up new opportunities for us to do things, and we're never going to remove people from it. It's not feasible. I was at a conference recently where we were talking about remote hydrography, and there was still there was an army of people behind the robots that were off doing these things. So we can't make ourselves redundant just yet.
Yeah, well, it comes back to another. I've been reflecting on this a lot over the last few years after having been involved in successive kind of iterations of new technological developments in terms of how they affect our ability to do ecology and to do science underwater, basically. And it's that point of going like, when is enough, right? To a point where, okay, technological thresholds that maybe unlock whole new tranches of understanding, but if you end up kind of bogged down in the technology, then it's basically like an arms race of new stuff. Like you think about it like TVs, as an analogy, going, oh, well, I'll go and buy another TV. Then 3 months later, a new version of the same thing comes out. And it's like a rabbit hole that you can get pulled down and start becoming obsessed by progressively finer and finer and finer resolution that ultimately isn't changing the ecological inference that you're trying to make about the system. So there comes a point, I think, probably in most scientists' lives where they might go, do you know what? I'm happy with that level. You know, I don't want a ultra high definition TV because my eyes are standard definition. It's like I ultimately the ecological inference I can make from my work is kind of comes to a point where you go, that's good enough for what I want to do, and ultimately the improvements thereafter might just be it might be lost in the wash, but that doesn't make me into a Luddite, right? But what I'm saying is trying to understand the role that technology plays in understanding ecological systems, and those they're like two sides of the same coin, really.
It's a really good point, and I've kind of thought about this as well quite a bit. And the new technologies allows you to ask new questions, but it doesn't mean the old questions you asked are invalid.
Yeah.
And sometimes the new technology asks you to see things in a higher resolution, in more detail. But what level of detail do you really need to answer the question? So we can become kind of slaves to all the shiny lights and buttons, and and the funding agencies can as well.
I think that's it. It depends on the question that the funding agencies are prepared to fund.
Is this just us now starting to show our vintage?
Yeah.
It's like, I definitely didn't feel like this when I was in my early 20s. Jer, I don't know, like, what do you think where you're coming from now?
Oh, no, it doesn't feel that way to me now, but I feel like it might change with time.
But yeah, as I say, still using Windows XP illegally on my machine, because I can't deal with the trauma of upgrading.
No, anyway. But I mean, like, this is very valid point. Like to not lose sight from what is that you're really trying to achieve and what is really trying to do and answer a question versus like I have all this technology and like let's do this now. You could do the other things.
Do the important stuff, not just the fun stuff. The important stuff is what you should be doing, and it might be fun, but it might be boring. But if it's important, do it.
Important is always boring and mundane.
No.
Joking. I want to hear about those autonomous vehicles, about those robots. How do they work, and are they just working for like weeks at a time, days at a time? Are you kind of uploading the path that they're following the path and scanning? Like how does all that work?
They're pre-programmable survey instruments. So they're like little tiny submarines, if you like, with instrument packages. And you pre-program them and you say, I want you to go down and say collect this piece of video of the seabed and follow this prescribed paths. And they may have, and they usually do have, some avoidance technology, and if they bump into a rock, they can see it and they go around it. But they do have limits, and their limits are often in terms of the payload, how heavy they are, and the energy requirements to move them. So the batteries, the bigger the batteries, the heavier they are, and it becomes a lose-lose situation. So they're not out for weeks. They're out for hours to if you're lucky, a bit, a day or so. So they do have limits to what they're doing. But the real beauty about them is that they collect really clean data because they're not tethered to a ship that's bobbing about on the surface that may be tugging them. There's no human trying to steer them. They steer themselves far more accurately than we can. So they produce really nice, clean data. But as Alex was saying, they can't do complicated tasks. They can do routine tasks, and seabed mapping is perfect for them. And so that's really where they come in. The other technology we talked about are ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. So this is where the system is tethered to the ship, but it has its own propulsion. So you sit on the surface and there's cameras on the vehicle and you can drive it around and you can use it to explore. So a lot of the places we go are too deep for divers, but you can send the ROV down there. And when I'm not working on MarPAM, I'm often working in the deep ocean, kilometers down. And the only things you can get down there are these ROVs. And again, they can collect data, but you're steering them and you're flying them around. But you can have a whole team of people up on top looking at the computer screen saying, oh, that's interesting. Well, let's do this. Whereas if it's an individual in a submarine or a submersible or a dive, it's just that one person reacting. So these are just ways for us to access the seabed and collect information. ROVs are our hands and eyes on the seabed, and AUVs, being autonomous, are really good at collecting really clean data routinely. And they're both really, really useful.
So based on what I gather now is like you have like a mission when you have a ship that goes out on the sea, and then you deploy some of those autonomous vehicles, and then maybe ship moves somewhere else, and then you have operators, operating ROVs and all that. What amount of data after that mission, when that ship comes back with all the missions, ROVs, AVs, and so on? Like how much data do you have? I don't know how you're going to quantify that in the terabytes region.
Yeah, it's completely dependent on what you've asked, or what your survey plan was. So if you go out for a day, you may have tens of gigabytes of, if we're just talking about acoustic data, just multibeam echo sounder. So that's your bathymetry, your depth measurements, and your backscatter, which are your textural or roughness characteristics. So that would be, you're looking at tens of gigs. And if you ran an acoustic survey for a week, then you're approaching a terabyte. If you ran an acoustic survey, but that also depends on the system. So you can have some systems only collect in one frequency, others collect across several. And if you're collecting several frequencies, then you're surveying the same bit of seabed 5 times, for example, then that's 5 times the amount of data. And then the systems, we can also collect the water column if we really want to. So that increases it 3-fold, 4-fold in our memory demands. So it's completely dependent on what your intention is, what your plan was when you left. And so if you have a multi-beam echo sounder on your ship, a multi-beam echo sounder on your ROV, and a multi-beam echo sounder on your AUV, they're all collecting data in different resolutions. So your ROV would be centimetric, your AUV would be decimetric to metric, and then your ship is metric to 50, 100 meters, which depending on water depth, where Andy is in the abyssal stuff, then your footprint is huge. And your resolution is much larger than what you would get with these other systems. But it's a sliding scale, it's the short way. But I think just to come back to what we do, the AUVs and the ROVs, what they do, which we can't necessarily do from purely shipborne systems, is you can monitor the exact same area. So you can set your mission, your AUV in particular, you can say, right, last year you did these 4 lines, and you can give them the exact same coordinates, and you go over that, and in theory you should be traversing those exact same 4 lines in the same pattern, in the same way, so that there isn't any deviation. So then you've got a direct comparison year to year, or whichever your intervening period is. If you do that from a ship, as Andy said, you've got your wind conditions, your surface conditions, your swell conditions. Everything's a little bit different, and it's close enough for science, but it's not exact. So that's what those are some other advantages. We have increased accuracy. It doesn't have to be high resolution, but we really do have that capability to improve the accuracy of what we're doing.
And how those underwater vehicles position themselves, because like GPS is not an option.
No, we position the ship by GPS, and then obviously GPS doesn't work underwater.
Yeah.
So underwater we use what we call ultra short baseline navigation systems, acoustic systems, and so you put a beacon on your instrument, and it will range itself to the ship.
Oh, okay.
So we have a position from the ROV to the ship, and then the ship to the satellite. But we can get these things very, very accurate. And with the ROVs as well, we use things like inertial navigation systems. So they have gyroscopes in them that feel where they're going. So they're estimating where they should be. And then they're also plotting where they are. So they can, if there's an error in the beacon from the ship, they can fill it in, they can smooth it out. So you between all these different navigation systems, we can get things down to centimeter scale, in the deep ocean, which is really quite incredible. And so we can get it very, very accurate now. But there has to be this
Gotcha.
ship to satellite and then ship to below water.
So it's not so much that they're like they're positioned them so super accurately. They position themselves accurately enough, but then with the data, with all the data that is also related with the GPS, and so you can kind of correct, and then you can, after processing, get your exact.
Yeah. We often use several navigation methods, so that so when one has some errors, the other navigation system might be working. So when you combine all of these, you get a more reliable position. And that's a whole science in itself that I leave to the technicians. But it's very, very important. Knowing where you are is critical. And we can get that very accurately by using different systems that take out each other's errors effectively.
So you mentioned technicians. So I'm just going to briefly ask the question: how big of a part of the whole MARPAM project or part of your work is to keep those vehicles running? Because I presume there is a servicing required, and salt water is corrosive environment, so they need to be serviced and cleaned. Like how big is it? Like oh, there are technicians are doing that, and this is not of your concern, or is it like a part of MARPAM project that you need to take care of all that as well?
Yeah, we're lucky. So the MARPAM itself is not responsible for those. We've invoked the power of the partners, so they've already got the team. So we used the small AUV, and we're present, I think, for the training course in Oban a few years ago, and we've deployed it in Mulroy Bay on the north coast of Ireland and in Strangford Lough in Northern Ireland, and so that's run by the Scottish Association for Marine Science, and they have a marine robotics team. So their responsibility is to do all of that maintenance, to program, to adjust the payloads, to make sure that the AUV has got the right tools for the tasks that it's going to do for the various projects that they're involved with. So we're lucky, we've basically we've hired it for the day, and we've trusted people to run it for us.
But it's not going to sink.
We're one of many users of this equipment. So lots of different projects and lots of different researchers and government agencies will be using this equipment. So it's been maintained, if you like, for us as part of an investment, collective investment in our countries, if you like, in trying to manage this marine environment and understand it. But we're one of many users. So.
Gotcha. Okay, so now you have all this data, and you now the fun stuff begins. Right? I don't know whether it's a really fun stuff or like not fun because in front of a computer, but that's really interesting. Let's say. So my first question would be: you have a lot of data, and that data, like you mentioned, really represents the same area, but from different angles, if you like. There's different wavelengths, and there's photographs, and there's all types of data. So for my very first question is like, do you have already methods that you can apply? And because one thing is to make, I'm guessing, now you can correct me, this is just my guess, is that first of all, first challenge is to make all those types of data into something consistent, like make one consistent view of the area based on all that data. And so I wonder, are there already methods and methods, I guess is a proper word, or techniques of doing that? Or is it part of your project also to develop, first you need to develop a method to actually have something consistent that then only you can analyze? Or are those methods already available to you?
No, it's both for MARPAM. So you've got methodologies which are well established and the techniques to do that. So for the acoustic data, the hydrographic data that come in, there are well established techniques for cleaning the bathymetric data, and that's come from the charting organisations. So in the UK, that's UKHO, but there are strict rules as to how that can be done, especially if those data are going to be used for navigation. We have principles, national principles for the analysis of video and imagery data. We have in the UK, which I think the Republic signs up to as well, but I'm not entirely sure. But we have a scheme called NMBA-QC, which is a quality control scheme for the analysis of faunal samples, so the macrofauna, the worms and stuff that comes out of the mud, the particle size analysis of the sediment. So there are all these factors, but what JER's doing is looking for new techniques. That's where JER steps in.
So the new thing, like we were discussing before, is trying to get the computers to develop a system whereby we can extract information automatically. And this is the idea where we can derive this at a scalable situation. And as Chris pointed out, it's not 100% perfect because there are bottlenecks, but this is a way we can do this effectively, consistent, or as consistently as possible, because we can compare this maybe with a human interpreter or what's actually happening on the ground. So we can collect ground truth data, like Andy was specifying before, with our video tows, and maybe with some, grab samples from the sea floor, where we take a physical sample and compare it with what might have modeled out of our computer algorithms. So those things are still in development, that kind of very specific thought behind that, but we're progressing through it. We have a few new ideas that we've already published and released out, and we're coming up with a few extra things down the pipeline as well. So
Joe's been very humble here. He's been working on sediment waves, and sediment waves are like sand dunes on the seabed, but the currents are moving these. And only certain organisms like to live in mobile sand. So in a way, they represent, if you like, a bit of a crude habitat. So Joe's been trying to train the computers to map these very accurately, but also about dimensions and things like that.
Yeah, so the idea is that these features can change depending on the habitat you're looking at, and they don't all occur at this one size. They can occur at a variety of scales, and you need to develop a technique that's flexible in that domain. And that was the idea behind our first release, or behind our first research release, was establishing that method to take out these features at different scales. Now, what we want to try and do is develop tools to help further analyze these features that we've extracted from, we'll say, multi-beam data, and try and infer things about the environment that are a bit more intuitive than just saying, this is a sand dune. We might be able to develop something like, we can actually infer maybe a current speed from this sand dune and get an idea of how this affects the environment, or how organisms might respond to a certain current speed or what have you.
And in doing that, if we can map the current speeds from these sediment waves, which we think we can do, actually, we're just about to publish that, then suddenly we've got a whole amount of current information at the seabed, current velocity information at the seabed over an area, as opposed to just a measurement at a point where you actually measured it. So it becomes like a predictive tool for how strong are the currents in this area, which way are they flow. So, and this is just from a seabed map, so there's power in deriving information from these maps as well over large areas very accurately, using AI, as we'd be at it forever trying to measure each of these features. And we can get the computer just to do it. So it's quite exciting what JER's doing.
So I guess this follow like a standard like machine learning, where you first build a model and you validate the model, you see how it responds, and then you can feed. So then ultimately you can basically feed not processed data into the model, because then it can take kind of in parallel analyze all that and give you final results.
Yeah, the concept is you provide some information to the computer, but hold some back and get it to develop a model, and then you check it against the information, see how accurately it did it, and then where it is inaccurate, you get it to improve that process, so until eventually you come up with something that that is reliable. What's interesting about these computers is they make silly mistakes that we wouldn't do because they think in a very different way. And that's where you still need the humans, because they can do things very quickly and very accurately, but then to do something fundamentally stupid, where you say, "Oh, I guess that bit of seabed does look a bit like a submarine dune, but it's obvious to me it's a shipwreck," But the computer just goes, "Oh, well, I thought," and off it goes. So, it's an interesting process, and it's where the humans and the computers meet, and that's.
I guess that part of training the model is the most challenging, and validating the results, and now getting your confidence rate and so on. But once that's done, that's where you really have a benefit of you can let it run and get
That's the important bit, is that you need to understand the limitation of the model behind it, so you can actually make an informed decision about the information that it gives out to you. So you don't just take it and run. You kind of have to interrogate it a small bit as well and see, is this in fact what you're seeing? And that's the important point behind that as well. And that, I suppose, is where the expert interpreter is a valuable resource, is because you could get a couple of these, because you're mapping these things over time, so you're getting constant data flow. We'll say that's the ideal situation, and that your expert interpreter is interrogating, we'll say, the output from these models and properly trying to identify, is it correct in saying what it's saying, and if
then
it is,
creates like a validation data set to validate.
Exactly, yeah. And then you can maybe escalate the inferences from that to maybe some authority then, who can make an informed decision based on that collective, that kind of computer human collective.
Is it you're doing it in R or Python?
My research is in Python, so I'd be mainly Python based, right? Yeah.
I thought like in an academic environment, like R is the king, and it's like no.
It was all right. There was some. I made some forays into R early on, but I found that the Python, for me anyway, personally, was a bit easier to get a handle on from because I started from basics at the very beginning of the PhD with coding, and I found more resources for Python for a beginner anyway, personally myself. So
for sure, I'm a Python guy myself, so I understand. Okay, listen, folks. Before we wrap this up, a question that I'm asking always, often, to my guests, and especially when you're, like a deep in the front line of, conservation and trying to understand the nature and habitat and so on. You obviously see the changes over the years, and obviously to see the impacts of both, human impacts and, climate is actually human impact as well. What are your views for the future? How it's going to play out. Are we manage to stop the loss of biodiversity and all that? Are we almost helpless? And like Alex, you almost excused from this question because I asked that question last time. So if you want to elaborate more, then please. But I know that I've already was asking you that question. But Andy and Jared, like especially. Like what are your views, and especially that your age differences, like you might have I'm wondering whether it's going to be like a pessimistic, optimistic view, or like you kind of on the same boat on this, so to say.
What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah. Well, I think if we were to follow the path that we're following now, that we can't certainly expect to have a good outcome in terms of the environment and conservation. But if we aspire to do better, so if we follow what scientists are saying, that climate change is profoundly impacting our world and we need to alter what we're doing, then if we were to strictly adhere to that, then I think we would have a good shot, because we undersell, I feel like personally anyway, that we undersell what we're capable of, and we are capable of maybe ratcheting that back if we were really dedicated to it. But that's the important bit about it, I suppose, is the dedication to that change, like, as well.
I guess I'm a pessimist that believes in a silver lining. I've been watching the climate debate since the 1980s. I'm a bit older than Jer, and I must admit, it's incredibly depressing. and that humans and society seem to have an intrinsic inability in their nature to grasp the fundamental problem that we're facing. And I think it's really bleak. But and I think, particularly recently, it's become really stark that things are really happening now in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of melting ice caps, all these difficulties. And we're not really tackling it by changing our lifestyle and the way we operate, the way we have to. So I do think we're in for a really rough ride, but I also think that humans are a very adaptive species, and I think we will get through this, but unfortunately not until we've beaten ourselves up in the process, because we're just not doing the right things now, and we're going to pay a bigger price later, and we will pay a bigger price later. And I think it's very depressing, and I think it's very bleak, and I feel sorry for my children. But I do think we'll get through this. But we really don't help ourselves, and it worries me.
Do you think that this is because the changes are so slow that they were hard to grasp? It's like, like whatever happens, and as they accelerate, and then as you start to see impacts year on year, then it's like a red light. It's like, oh crap.
Yeah, I think there is an element of that. And it's the frog in the kettle thing. You don't know to change around you. But I think there's also something very intrinsic in human nature, and perhaps a healthy skepticism in the doom and gloom prophecies that may generate. But actually, some of them might be real, and we need to do something about them. But I think it's perhaps a little bit more fundamental that at the end of the day, we have our lives and we have our things that we think are essential, and we just don't look ahead that far as a species. And our leaders aren't looking ahead because they're actually worried about their votes, and our industrialists aren't looking ahead because they're worried about their profits. And everyone knows that this is an issue, but collectively, everyone is unable to deal with this until it happens. And then when we really feel the impact, when it really becomes, and it is happening in terms of wildfires and things, we'll do something, but it's almost too late there. And we know this, but we're not. And I'm responsible. I still drive a car that isn't electric, etc., etc. But I think we will survive, certainly as a species, and almost definitely as a civilization. But we're going to go through some tough times, and maybe we have to do that, and maybe we'll learn from that. But we should have been doing it 10 years ago. We should be doing it now, but we're not. We're not doing it. It seems to be intrinsic in our nature, and okay, but it's okay. That's my feeling, and maybe that's a bit not a nice way to end this conversation. But wake up, people. You got to change, and we'll get there.
We can't say that though, can we, Andy? We've just been speaking about collecting all these data from diesel burning research vessels.
Absolutely,
it's
absolutely. But we're talking now in Ireland about putting them onto vegetable oil, actually, and looking at carbon footprints. And we are doing these things, but we're just doing it too late. So like you say, there's lots of inconsistencies in this and hypocrisy in this, and I'm, for one, a hypocrite. But that's what we have to work out individually and collectively. And maybe we won't do that as a species until there really is a crunch, and then I'm sure we will adapt. And I guess that's what I'm saying. Sorry to really depress everybody.
No, you're okay. I mean, this is the reality. Alex, you have anything? Any second? Do you want a second attempt at your predictions for the future?
I don't know. I think what Anushka said was quite telling last time, in that we're going to experience a change in the way that our ecosystems are made up. So that maybe mass loss of biodiversity, or it may just be a mass change. So you could see a lot of different species existing in areas that they didn't previously. We've seen maybe historically from other mass extinction events that you get new speciations. So a changed world, it's not going to be the one we have now. I think it's very much there, but is it an absolute doom story? None of us have a crystal ball. The projections aren't good. We can all front up to that. We can all face that. But the ultimate consequences, say for the resilience of the natural world, I think like Andy was saying, humans will persist in one form or another, and I think a lot of the marine environmental organisms will persist in one way or another. It's just, what does that way or another look like when we get there? And we have the consciousness. There's a lot of effort throughout the world and in Europe and our islands in particular to try and implement new forms of conservation. So all the jurisdictions are trying to create marine protected areas. We're looking at new ways to try and protect different species, to expand from traditional ways of conservation where you just draw a line around something and leave it alone, and trying to be a bit more adaptive. So maybe it's too little too late, but at least there is effort. There are a heroic few. And then the rest are getting dragged along.
Folks, thanks for that. Thanks a lot for that. And words with wisdom. And you already said, people, we need to change. And I think that this is inevitable. And I think we all, even if you're a climate change campaigner and so on, and if you have your house heated in the oil, coming November there is 1,000 liters of kerosene coming to your tank because you got to have a heat. But I think that the problem is that we need to tackle scale, because this is one car. There's no problem, but then you talk about, okay, I have let's all have electric cars, and okay, where you take rare metals to make all the batteries, and then where you're gonna store the mountain of old batteries, and etc. 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 So as always, I think that we need to learn to deal with the scale, because scale is killing us. All right, folks. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your this conversation. It's extremely interesting, and I am sure that our listeners and viewers learned a lot. And if they want to learn more, there's a MARPAM website. I'm going to put it in the show notes. All the best with your work. You're doing a great job. I think this is extremely important to have these projects that are cross borders. Gathering the data, and then all that remains is to have a hope that decision makers and policy makers will actually take that data into account and do what's right.
Thanks very much, Tommy. We'll talk about the worms eventually, I'm sure.
Yes, did we miss that? All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tommy. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Tommy. Thank you.